The pair found work at Westminster City Council, Duffy as a carpenter and Mulcahy as a plumber. On one job, Mulcahy had spotted a woman who he thought needed to be taught a lesson. He and Duffy went to her house after dark, intent on raping the woman.
So Duffy and Mulcahy break into the house and lay in wait for the woman whose house Mulcahy's been decorating. But the woman, thankfully, doesn't come home that night. She's gone to a friend's. This infuriates both Duffy and Mulcahy.
So you've got a plan developing here. They're starting to actually decide, well, this is what we're going to do. This isn't something that's opportunistic. This is something that's very much premeditated.
Duffy and Mulcahy were undeterred. They tried the same plan again with a different woman, but escaped from her house when she returned home with a man.
And they probably talk about, say, look, the thing about breaking into people's houses and waiting for them is no good because we don't know if they're gonna come back, we don't know if they're gonna come back with somebody else. So instead of that, how about we actually drive around, find someone, see someone on the street, and then we pounce on them on a dark alley or something like that. So I think the rush that they got from breaking into the house just motivate them to go and do the real thing.
By 1980, both men were in their early 20s and married, but their lust for rape remained. 2 years later, they were ready to strike.
In October 1982, they found the first one. 21-year-old girl coming back from a party carrying a teddy bear. They put a knife to her throat and forced her into a garden of an empty house. They said, I think it was Duffy who said, "Don't worry, we only want the teddy bear." Nothing could have been further from the truth. They stripped the girl, gagged her, blindfolded her, and raped her.
From then on, the attacks became incredibly prolific. At one point, there was 3 in one night. They would generally drive around together, listening to music to psych themselves up. They carried with them a kit of balaclavas or masks. Mulcahy would put gaffer tape inside his jacket, which would then be used to gag the victims. He'd often blindfold them as well.
Paul Cheston from the Evening Standard newspaper recalls the fear felt across the capital.
That added to the sense of terror felt by Londoners that it was almost a military-style operation, and the planning that was going into it was much more than just spur of attack, moment attacks.
Mulcahy would always ask the victims their names and addresses as well, and would often steal items which had their address on, library cards, that sort of thing. The idea was that if these victims went to the police, we will find you, and so on. They always made sure their victims were reduced to a state of abject terror.
One such attack occurred in the summer of 1984.
The attack on the 2 Danish au pairs took place in July 1984. That night, Duffy and Mulcahy had been driving around for a long time, unable to find a victim. And finally, they saw these 2 18-year-old girls walking along Spaniards Road on the edge of Hampstead Heath. They'd been out in the West End and missed the last train home and were walking back. They decided to attack them both. Duffy had a replica gun, Mulcahy had a knife. They were dragged off the road and onto the heath and brutally assaulted.
2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. And the family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he'd buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find her, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. And that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham Police Station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that'll be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. Charles Ng moved into Lake's new remote ranch in the northern Californian wilderness.
It was the combination of the 2 individuals that made them into the terrible killing machine that they became.
Here, Lake and Ng shared their depraved fantasies, and together they devised a fearsome plan to murder men, women, and even infants on an industrial scale. On the grounds of the 2-acre property, Lake had built a subterranean bunker for his and his partner Ng's murderous purpose.
In Calaveras County, east of San Francisco, where, effectively, Lake set up the dungeon that he'd always wanted for his Operation Miranda, where Ng came to join him.
Based on Lake's obsession with the book The Collector, the pair teamed up to put Leonard Lake's fearsome fantasy, his so-called Miranda plan, into motion.
The Miranda plan was the means by which he was going to be the one who fathered all the new children in the world after the nuclear Armageddon had happened and he was in his enclave with all of his sex slaves.
That's what he was creating with Ng, and that's what he had been fantasizing for 20 years before he met Ng. The project's aim is to capture your ideal woman, enslave her, and have her be your sexual slave until you're done with her, at which time you kill her. In the case of Ng and Lake, the killings involve much more than killings, much more than just sex. They involved torture. They involved the photographing of the victims. It was a nightmare that somebody from Hollywood could not dream up for a horror movie.
Ing arrives, and in a sense, they combust the fantasy because they start saying to each other, what we need is to have lots of children to repopulate the world and make better citizens, a kind of social engineering project through a very odd prism.
Ing was a very shy person who himself could not have done this, but happily joined the venture so that he would have a chance of the kind of sexuality his shyness made impossible.
On July the 25th, 1984, Lake and Ing's perverse Miranda plan was begun. The first woman they were thought to have abducted and enslaved was Deborah Dubbs. The duo would in fact murder her husband Harvey, and their 16-month-old son Sean. Answering an ad for video equipment, Lake and Ing showed up at their apartment in San Francisco. The pair likely killed Harvey and the baby soon after. Lake and Ing then kidnapped 33-year-old Deborah and took her back to their underground bunker.
In the case of the Dubbs family, they took all of their photographic equipment. Mr. Dubbs used to do photography work on the side. They abducted his wife and raped her.
In Wilseyville in Calaveras County, Lake and Ing kept Deborah prisoner. In what would become their modus operandi, the callous killing team would torture, defile, and humiliate Deborah.